200 acres of Virginia farmland, quiet under a gray October sky, a man on a porch, coffee going cold in his hand. He has done this every morning for 3 years, and every morning he walks past the same closed door at the end of the hallway. Never touches the handle, never looks directly at it. Then she appears, crossing the south field, carrying something covered with a dish towel. The smell of cinnamon reaches him before she climbs the steps. She sets it on the railing, golden lattice crust, still steaming at the edges. He looks at the pie, he looks at her standing there, flour on her cheek, waiting the way she always waits, like she has nowhere else she needs to be. He opens his mouth and says the wrong thing. The stillness that follows is not embarrassment, not surprise. It is the stillness of a woman who has been waiting 3 years for exactly this moment and has decided, at last, not to look away from it. She takes one small step back. My name is Theron Gantry. I am 50 years old. I own 200 acres of land outside a small town in Harlan County, Virginia, and that land has been in my family for 3 generations. I want to tell you about the 3 years I spent standing in front of a closed door. Every morning I walked down the hallway of my house and past the east corner room, the room where my wife Cressida used to do the bookkeeping. I knew exactly what was inside without opening it. A stack of ledgers on the desk, arranged by year, the most recent one left open to a page she never finished. A coffee mug on the corner of the desk, still holding the last half-inch of coffee she poured. The morning we drove to the hospital for the last time. A gray cardigan hanging on the back of the chair because she was always cold in that room, even in summer. 3 years, every single morning. My hand knew where the doorknob was without me having to look. But I never turned it. People in town called me strong. They said it at the funeral, and they kept saying it for months afterward, whenever they saw me in the feed store or at the gas station. Theron Gantry, strong as iron, back at work the next day, keeping that ranch running like nothing happened. I let them say it. The truth was simpler and less flattering. I was not strong. I was just a man who had learned to keep moving because the moment I stopped, the empty house would become real in a way I could not survive. The ranch helped. There was always something that needed doing. The cattle do not stop needing water because you are grieving. The fields do not wait for you to feel ready. I had installed GPS guidance systems on the tractors the year before Cressida got sick, and automated irrigation on the south fields, and cameras in the 2 main barns that fed to a monitor in the kitchen. The technology handled the things that used to require 2 people. In some ways, it made the loss easier to manage. In other ways, it made the house feel quieter, because now even the work that used to bring me inside did not need me there. I woke up at the same time every morning, drank the same black coffee, put on the same work clothes, went outside and did not come back until there was nothing left to do. I kept every routine exactly as it had been. I told myself I was maintaining stability. Cressida would have told me I was hiding, and she would have been right, and she would have said it with that particular expression she had where she was not angry, but simply could not pretend not to see the truth. She said something to me the last night she was clear enough to have a real conversation. We were sitting in the hospital room, and it was late, and the nurses had stopped coming in as often. She took my hand and she said, "You will keep living, Theron. The only question is whether you are actually going to live or just keep breathing." I got angry. I told her not to talk like she was already gone. She squeezed my hand and did not argue. She was right, and she knew I knew she was right, and that was enough for her. For 3 years I kept breathing. The east corner room stayed locked. Her clothes stayed in the closet. The calendar on the kitchen wall stayed on the month she died because I could not make myself turn the page. Every time I walked past the corner room, I could see her in there through the closed door, glasses on, pen moving across the ledger page, not looking up but aware I was there, about to tell me not to forget to eat lunch. She was not there. I knew she was not there. But the version of her that lived in my memory was so specific and so stubborn that I could not walk past that door without feeling the weight of it. The woman who crossed the field between our 2 properties most regularly was Opaline Ingram. Opaline was 25 years old, and she owned the 60-acre farm directly to the south of mine. Her family had worked that land for as long as mine had worked ours, but her parents had decided 2 years ago to move to Richmond to be closer to their other daughter and the grandchildren. Opaline stayed. She took over the farm alone, and she ran it with the kind of focused competence that made older farmers uncomfortable because they could not quite figure out how to be condescending about it. She had a degree in agricultural management from Virginia Tech. I had watched her operate for 2 years before the Tuesday mornings became something I thought about consciously. She did not ask for help, and she did not complain about the difficulty of running a farm alone, but she also did not perform independence the way some people perform it, as a statement rather than a condition. She was simply someone who had assessed what needed doing and done it, and the competence was so natural that it did not announce itself. There was one afternoon in her first spring on her own when I watched her from my side of the fence line without her knowing I was watching. She was working on the irrigation pump that served her south greenhouse. The pump had seized and she had it disassembled on a tarp in the yard, parts laid out in order, a manual open beside her on a folding table. She worked through it methodically, stopping to read, making adjustments, testing. It took her 2 hours. When the pump ran again, she stood up and looked at it for a moment with her hands on her hips, and then she picked up the tarp and shook it clean and folded it and put it away. No celebration. No acknowledgement that she had just repaired a piece of equipment that most farmers would have called a surface professional to handle. She simply moved on to the next thing. That was the moment I had filed away and not examined. I understood now what I had been filing it as. She kept dairy goats, ran 2 greenhouses full of organic vegetables, and sold handmade cheeses and fruit preserves through an online store she had built herself. She fixed her own fences and drove her own tractors and negotiated directly with distributors without ever hiring someone to do it for her. She also used social media to market her products, which I had always privately dismissed as something for people who did not have real work to do. Cressida had run the bookkeeping for 22 years with the precision of someone who understands that a ranch does not fail dramatically. It fails through small inattentions compounded over seasons. She caught the small things. She caught them before they became large things. When she got sick and the East Corner room went quiet for the first time in our marriage, I hired an accountant from town to handle the numbers. He was competent. He did not know which columns Cressida had watched most carefully, or why or what the patterns in those numbers meant about the health of the land. I had to learn to read them myself. It took me the better part of a year. I never told anyone that. But every time I sat down with the ledgers, I was aware that I was learning a language she had already been fluent in, and that I was doing it without her there to correct my mistakes. She showed me I was wrong about that the same way she showed me I was wrong about most things, which was quietly and with evidence rather than argument. About 8 months before all of this happened, she sat down with me at my kitchen table and walked me through a system for taking pre-orders through the farm store I ran by the road. She set it up, showed me how to manage it, and left me to try it myself. By the end of the holiday season, my farm store revenue had nearly doubled. I did not thank her as well as I should have. She did not seem to need the thanks. Opaline had been coming to my house on Tuesday mornings for almost 3 years by the time any of this became complicated. It started 2 weeks after Cressida's funeral, when she appeared on my porch holding a pot of vegetable soup. She held it out and said, "I made too much. You can help me eat it." I knew it was an excuse so I would not feel pitied, and I was grateful for the excuse. I took the pot and told her she did not have to do that. She said, "I know," and that was how it began. After that, almost every Tuesday morning, she brought something over. Sometimes bread she had baked the night before, sometimes a container of stew, sometimes just 2 cups of coffee already poured, one for each of us. Every single time I told her she did not need to. Every single time she said, "I know." The rhythm of it was comfortable in a way I did not examine too closely. I started making sure there was extra coffee ready before 9 in the morning. I started planning my work so that the chores closest to the house got finished before she usually arrived. I did not think about what that meant. I hired Wendell Talbot that spring, when my longtime ranch hand moved back to West Virginia to take care of his mother. Wendell was 24 years old, and he came recommended by the owner of the Henderson farm, 3 miles east. He was quick and dependable, and he had the particular quality of young men who grew up doing physical work, which was that he could solve most problems with his hands before he was fully awake. He also said exactly what he was thinking at any given moment, without appearing to notice that other people did not always do this. His first week on the job, he encountered Opaline on a Tuesday morning. She was leaving a loaf of bread on the porch railing when he came around the side of the barn. She introduced herself and he introduced himself, and they had a brief conversation that I observed from a distance without being close enough to hear. That evening, at the end of the workday, Wendell asked me who she was. I told him she was Opaline Ingram, the neighbor to the south. He nodded. He said, "She is very pretty." I told him she was 25 years old and my neighbor and the daughter of people I had known for a long time. He said, "Okay, but does the neighbor thing mean she is off limits or just that you know her from before?" I told him to go home and get some sleep. He went. But the question stayed in the air of the barn long after he was gone, which I am sure was not his intention. Wendell did not have intentions of that kind. He was simply a young man who saw things directly and named them directly, and could not quite understand why other people would prefer not to. The Tuesday morning at the end of September started the same as every other one. I was sitting on the porch with my coffee when I saw Opaline crossing the south field. She was wearing jeans and a plaid flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up. Her dark hair pulled back the way she wore it when she was working, which was most of the time. She was carrying something covered with a dish towel. As she got closer, I could smell it before I could see it clearly. Cinnamon. Baked apples. The particular warmth of something that had come out of an oven not long ago. She climbed the porch steps and set the dish on the railing in front of me and pulled the towel back. It was an apple pie, golden brown and still faintly steaming at the edges, the lattice crust pressed down neatly at the sides. She had pressed small notches around the rim the way people do when they have made the same pie many times and know exactly how they want it to look. "Apples from the south trees," she said. "First batch came in sweet this year." I looked at the pie. I looked at the care that had gone into it, the time it had taken, the fact that she had done this on a Tuesday morning when she had a farm to run and animals to tend and greenhouses to check. I looked at her standing there with a streak of flour on her cheek that she had not noticed, waiting in the easy way she had of waiting, like she had nowhere else she needed to be. 3 years. She had been coming for 3 years and she had never once asked for anything in return. I was not thinking clearly. I looked at the pie and I looked at her, and I said the first thing that came into my head. The way you sometimes say the truest thing you mean to keep private, I said, "If only I were 20 years younger." I said it the way a man says something he means to be a small joke, a way of acknowledging something without naming it, a door he means to close before it opens all the way. I expected her to laugh, or to shake her head and change the subject the way she sometimes did when I said something that veered too close to territory neither of us had mapped. She did neither. She went still. Not the stillness of embarrassment or surprise, the stillness of someone who has been waiting for a moment and has decided when it arrives not to look away from it. She held my eyes, and the look on her face was calm and direct and completely serious. After a moment, she reached out and set the pie more firmly on the railing, as though making sure it was secure. Then she took one small step back. She said 20 years would not change a damn thing. Then she turned and went down the porch steps. Over her shoulder, she said, "I have to check the greenhouses." She walked back across the field the same way she always walked, steady and unhurried. I sat in my chair and watched her until the line of trees along the south fence swallowed her up. Then I sat there for a while longer. 20 years would not change a damn thing. I turned the sentence over. I looked at it from different angles. I tried to find the reading of it that made it simple. A statement about friendship, a comment about neighborliness, something that did not mean what the stillness in her eyes had made it seem to mean. The harder I worked at finding that simpler reading, the further away it got. Wendell came around from the far barn at midday looking for the mineral supplements I had picked up from the feed store the week before. I was in the equipment shed checking the hydraulics on the smaller tractor, and I told him where to find them. He located the bags and started loading them into the wheelbarrow, and then after a minute he said, without particularly looking at me, "Did the neighbor bring something good this morning?" I said she brought a pie. He said, "Apple?" I said yes. He kept loading the bags, and then he said, "Can I ask you something without you telling me to go home and sleep?" I said he could try. He said, "Does Miss Ingram bring food to any of the other neighbors the way she brings it here?" I set down the wrench I was holding. I thought about it. I had never seen her walk across another field with a covered dish. Not once in 3 years. I had never heard anyone else in the area mention her stopping by the way she stopped by here. The question was so simple and so obvious that I did not know how to explain to him or to myself why I had never asked it before. I told him I was not sure. He nodded and picked up the wheelbarrow and went back out into the sun. He did not press it. That was one of the things about Wendell that I was still learning to account for. He would say the thing and then leave you alone with it. He never seemed to need you to acknowledge that he had been right. That afternoon, I remembered something I had not thought about in months. The previous spring, after 3 days of hard rain, a section of Opaline's north fence had come down. I saw it from my side of the property line when I went out to check on the cattle after the storm. It was a significant break, the kind that would take half a day to repair properly, and that would let animals through if it was not addressed. I did not call or send a message. I loaded lumber and tools into the truck and drove over before breakfast. We worked on it most of the day, the two of us. Opaline knew what she was doing. She did not need direction or instruction. We just worked the way people who have been neighbors for a long time learn to work beside each other. When we finished, she brought out 2 bottles of water and sat down on the grass beside me and asked how much she owed me. I told her nothing. She looked at me then, the same look, the look I had not understood at the time, the look I was now beginning to understand in a way that sat uneasily at the back of my chest. I went to bed that night without an answer to anything, but I went to bed for the first time in 3 years wondering something I had not let myself wonder before. What would happen if I stopped pretending I did not already know? Leland Kincaid arrived at the ranch the following afternoon, which was not unusual. Leland was 67 years old and the chairman of the county agricultural board, a position he had held since before I took over the ranch from my father. He had known my father well, which meant he felt entitled to a degree of directness with me that he did not extend to everyone. He drove an old green truck and he never called ahead. Leland Kincaid had the kind of authority that comes from longevity rather than position, the authority of a man who has outlasted enough county officials and weather events and market cycles that people stopped questioning his judgment and started treating his opinions as a form of local geology. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had spent 67 years developing a clear picture of how the world worked and who treated departures from that picture with the same wariness he would treat an unfamiliar piece of equipment, not hostile, but cautious, and inclined to wait for evidence before adjusting his assessment. He came to talk about the fall planning meeting that the board held every year in October. We stood in the yard and went through the agenda, and I offered him coffee, and he said he would take a cup if it was already made. We sat on the porch and talked about the usual things. Water rights on the east side of the county, a road repair that had been promised and not delivered, the price of feed going up again. Then he looked out across the field toward the south, and he said, "I hear the Ingram girl has been coming by regular." I told him she was a good neighbor. He said, "She is, her family always was." He was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee mug in his hands the way he did when he was deciding how to say something. He said, "You know that Yarborough boy has been paying attention to her." Doyle Yarborough, from the Yarborough supply operation over on Route 11. I said I knew who he was. Leland said, "Good family, solid business sense, about the right age for her." He said it simply, without particular emphasis, the way a man of his generation said things he considered to be obvious facts about how the world worked. He was not trying to wound me. He probably did not know there was anything to wound. But the words landed where they landed, which was in exactly the place I had been trying to not look at for the past day and a half. Opaline Ingram, 25 years old, deserved someone her own age. That was what Leland was saying. That was what the whole county would say if anyone got the idea that there was something to say. She deserved someone who could build a future with her rather than asking her to walk into one that was already 3/4 finished and carrying the weight of everything that had come before. After Leland left, I sat on the porch for a long time. The coffee went cold. The light moved across the yard and I tracked it without really seeing it. I knew who Doyle Yarborough was. I had seen him around town over the past year. Tall, well put together, the kind of easy confidence that comes from growing up knowing your family had money and standing. He had started showing up at community events that I was pretty sure he had not attended before Opaline came home from college and took over the farm. He was polite and he was capable, and on paper he was everything a reasonable person would point to and say, "Yes, that is a good match." I did not like him. I examined that feeling carefully and honestly, and I could not find anything in it that was about him specifically. He had not done anything wrong. He had not been unkind or dishonest or careless with anyone I knew of. What I did not like was the fact that I did not like him, which told me something I was not entirely ready to hear. I went inside when the sun was low. I walked down the hallway. I passed the east corner room. My hand found the doorknob the way it always did, in the dark and without looking. This time I did not immediately walk on. I stood there. The door was cool under my palm. I could feel the grain of the old wood. I knew what was inside: the ledger, the mug, the cardigan. 3 years of careful stillness on the other side of 8 inches of pine. Standing in the hallway with my hand on the door, I understood for the first time that I had been wrong about the way I was living. Keeping things in their places was not the same as honoring what had been there. Maintaining the exact shape of a life that no longer existed was not strength. It was the most elaborate form of holding still that I knew how to perform, and I had been performing it for 3 years and calling it loyalty. I did not open the door. I was not ready for that yet, but I stood there long enough to feel the full weight of the question that I had been setting aside every morning for 3 years. Long enough to let myself acknowledge that the question had a different shape now than it had the day before. Long enough to understand that a woman had walked across a field and looked at me with clear eyes and said something true, and I had sat on my porch and watched her walk away and done nothing, and that doing nothing was its own kind of answer. I went to bed. I lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling. If I was wrong about what she meant, if the look and the words had been simpler than I was reading them, then I had spent the past 2 days making something out of nothing and making myself feel things I had no business feeling. That would be embarrassing. That would be the kind of mistake a lonely man makes when someone is kind to him for long enough. But if I was not wrong, then something had been happening in the space of those Tuesday mornings for a long time, quietly and without either of us naming it, and I had been keeping myself too careful and too still to see it. The ceiling did not have an answer. The dark room did not have an answer. The empty half of the bed did not have an answer. But for the first time in 3 years, the questions I was asking were about what might still be possible rather than what had already been lost. And I did not know whether that was something to be grateful for or something to be afraid of. I decided it was probably both. For nearly 2 weeks after the morning of the apple pie, I watched myself the way you watch a man you are not entirely sure you trust. I noticed things I had not let myself notice before, small things, the kind of details that accumulate over time without announcing themselves. And then one day, you realize they have been there all along, waiting for you to stop looking in the other direction. Opaline knew I took my coffee black without sugar. She had never asked. It was simply one of the things she knew, the way she knew which days I hauled cattle to the vet in Clarksburg, and which weeks of the month the workload made me short with people. On those weeks, she came on Tuesday mornings and stayed 20 minutes instead of 40. She did not explain the shorter visit. She just seemed to understand that what I needed on those mornings was not company, but the simple fact of someone having shown up. She knew how I loaded the truck. She knew which side of the fence line needed attention in wet seasons. She knew that I ate lunch late and that I would not eat at all if there was nothing already prepared, which was why what she brought on Tuesdays was always something that kept well and required no effort from me beyond opening the container. I had filed all of this away under the category of good neighbor for 3 years. I had been comfortable in that category. It required nothing of me except gratitude and the occasional repayment in kind, which I had offered when her north fence came down and when her delivery truck needed a jump start in my driveway last winter. Now I looked at the same collection of facts and saw a different shape in them. There was a Tuesday morning 3 weeks before the apple pie, before any of this had names, when Opaline had arrived to find me in a worse state than usual. The South herd had a respiratory illness moving through it, and I had spent 2 nights sleeping badly and one night not sleeping at all. I had not told her any of this. She arrived at 8:55, the same time she always arrived, and she looked at me once, when she came up the porch steps, and then she said nothing about how I looked. She set down the bread she had brought, and she poured 2 cups of coffee, and she sat down and she started talking about a problem she was having with one of her distributors, a disagreement about delivery schedules that required some strategy to resolve. She talked for 20 minutes. I said almost nothing. At the end, she gathered her things and said she had to check on the goats, and she left. It was only afterward, sitting in the quiet she'd left behind, that I realized what she had done. She had not tried to help me with my problem because she knew I did not want help. She had given me 20 minutes of something else to think about, something manageable, something that had a clear answer if you thought about it the right way. She had treated my state of mind with the same practical intelligence she brought to everything, without making me feel managed or handled. I had thanked her for the bread. I had not found a way to thank her for the other thing. Looking back at it now, from the other side of the apple pie morning and everything that had followed, I understood that the other thing was not something she had done for me. It was something she was, and I had been sitting across from it every Tuesday morning for 3 years without letting myself see it clearly. She had not brought food to the Hendersons' 2 properties over when old Gerald Henderson lost his wife. She had sent a card, the way people do. She had not appeared on their porch on a Tuesday morning with soup. I knew this because Gerald Henderson had mentioned it to me at the feed store once, saying he had been surviving on casseroles from the church ladies and not managing particularly well. Wendell said it without meaning to say anything significant. He was reorganizing the mineral supplements in the equipment shed one afternoon, and he said without looking up, "Does Miss Ingram bring food to the Hendersons too, or just here?" I told him just here as far as I knew. He kept stacking bags. He did not say anything else. He did not need to. The phone rang that same evening after the sun was down and I had finished the last walk of the barns. When I answered, the woman on the other end said, "This is Petra Ingram, Opaline's mother. I hope I am not calling too late." Petra Ingram had a voice that reminded me of her daughter in its directness, except that Petra had 25 more years of practice at using that directness without softening it for the listener. She asked how I was doing. She asked how the ranch was holding up through the dry stretch we had been having. She made 2 minutes of conversation that felt like the hallway before the room she actually wanted to enter. Then she said, "I want to speak plainly with you, Theron, if that is all right." I told her to go ahead. She said, "Opaline does not tell me things. She never has. She handles everything herself, and she has since she was about 16 years old. But I am her mother, and I have been watching her for 25 years, and I know the difference between the way she sounds when everything is fine and the way she sounds when she is carrying something she has decided not to put down." I waited. Petra said, "I do not know exactly what is happening between the two of you, and I am not asking you to tell me. What I am asking you to understand is this. If you do not have serious intentions, then the kindest thing you can do is let her know that clearly. Do not let your silence be the thing she has to interpret on her own." I said, "Mrs. Ingram, I am not sure I know what my intentions are yet." There was a pause. Then she said, "That is a more honest answer than I expected." After a moment, she said, "Then figure it out, Theron. And do not take longer than you need to." She said good night, and she hung up. I stood in the kitchen holding the phone after the call ended. The refrigerator hummed. The clock above the stove read 8:40. I looked at the chair on the far side of the kitchen table, the one that had been Cressida's, the one I had not moved or used or acknowledged in 3 years. It sat at its angle to the table, exactly as it had always sat. I had been stepping around it for so long that I had stopped seeing it as a choice. The following evening, I drove to the county agricultural board meeting in town. Leland Kincaid found me during the break when people were standing around with cups of bad coffee. He asked about a fence repair I had mentioned at the last meeting. I told him it was finished. He nodded and looked satisfied. Then he said, "You know Doyle Yarborough has been talking to some of the distributors on the north end of the county. Smart kid. He is thinking regionally." I said that was good for his business. Leland said, "It would be good for the Ingram farm too, if things go in that direction." 2 operations like that working together, you are talking about real scale. 260 acres combined market access. That is a serious agricultural enterprise. He said it without any apparent awareness that he was describing a future he was laying out like a map, complete with a destination that did not include me. He was talking about land and business in practical sense. The math of it was clean. The math of it made sense. I finished my coffee and said goodnight and drove home. On the highway with the dark fields moving past on both sides, I felt something I had not felt in a long time. Not sadness, not grief, something more active than either of those. Something with an edge to it. I was 50 years old and I had run my family's land for over 20 years, and I had been a decent husband and a reliable neighbor, and I had done every single thing I was supposed to do. And sitting in my truck on a county highway on a Wednesday night, I understood with sudden clarity that I had also been standing to the side of my own life for 3 years, telling myself it was out of respect for what I had lost, when the truth was simpler and less dignified than that. I was afraid, not of Opaline, not of what the county would say, afraid of wanting something again, afraid of how much it would cost if I reached for something and lost it. 7 days after the board meeting, a week before the autumn festival, Opaline came to the farm store to drop off cases of her preserves and cheese. We had a standing arrangement to sell each other's products on weekends, one of the practical collaborations that had grown naturally out of being neighbors with complementary inventories. I was restocking the east wall when she came through the door carrying the first case. We worked side by side for a while, stacking and arranging. Then I asked, without planning to ask, if she was going to the fall festival. She set down the case she was carrying. She looked at me for a moment before she answered. She said, "Doyle asked me." I said I had heard something about that. She said, "I have not given him an answer yet." The space between those two sentences was the size of an open door. She was not telling me about Doyle Yarborough because she wanted my opinion of Doyle Yarborough. She was telling me because she was giving me the chance to say something. One sentence. One honest sentence and the door would stay open. I looked at her. I thought about Leland Kincaid's voice on the topic of 260 acres. I thought about Petra Ingram telling me to figure out my intentions. I thought about 25 years separating me from the woman standing 4 feet away from me in my own farm store, and all the ways that gap would be visible and commented upon in a town this size, and all the questions she would have to answer on my behalf every time she walked into a room without me. I said, "Doyle is a good man." Her expression changed. It was not dramatic. It was the small, precise change of someone who has received the answer they had been half expecting and finds that half expecting it does not make it easier to receive. She said, "That is not what I asked." I said, "He is young. He has a solid operation. He understands the kind of work you do." She said, "Are you giving him a reference now?" I turned away. I started straightening jars on the shelf behind me, jars that were already as straight, and I kept my hands busy with that while I said, "I just think you should consider what makes sense for your future." The room was quiet for long enough that I counted the seconds of it without meaning to. Then she said, very quietly and very evenly, "You are making this decision for me again." She closed the empty crates. She said goodbye. She walked out. I stood in the farm store alone, with my hands still on the jars, and I understood with the particular clarity that comes too late that I had done the exact thing she had warned me against. I had taken the question of what was right for her life and answered it myself without asking her what she thought. I had done it because it was easier than saying what was true, and what was true was that I was standing in my own store, feeling something I had not felt in 3 years, about a woman who deserved better than my fear, dressed up as consideration for her well-being. 2 days after that, Wendell came back from picking up parts in town and mentioned, with his characteristic absence of social calculation, that he had run into some people at the hardware store. Someone had asked about me and Opaline in the way that meant the whole county was asking, which was inevitable in a place's size once people started to paying attention. Wendell, not understanding that some information is given strategically and other information is simply dropped into a pond, had apparently said that he thought his boss had feelings for the Ingram woman, but was not doing anything about it. He reported this to me with the particular expression of someone who had realized mid-sentence that he may have made an error but could not now identify exactly what the error was. He said, "I think Doyle Yarborough was in there." He did not say anything. He just kind of nodded and left. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "Wendell." He said, "Yes, sir." I said, "You did not do anything wrong." He looked relieved but also confused about why he was being let off the hook. I said, "I am the one who has not done anything right." He nodded slowly, taking this in. Then he said, "Are you going to?" I did not answer him. But I thought about the answer for the rest of the afternoon. The night of the autumn festival, I stayed home. I had finished everything that needed doing by 7 o'clock, which meant I had no excuse that was not simply the truth. I told myself I had correspondence to catch up on. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at it for approximately 4 minutes before I gave up the pretense. I thought about what Opaline would be doing, not in the way that feeds on itself and becomes misery, but with a specific and honest attention. She would be doing whatever she did when she was in a public situation that required her to be present without being entirely comfortable, which was the same thing she did in all situations, which was to pay close attention to the people around her and ask the questions that led to conversations rather than performances. She was good at that. She had been good at it on my porch on Tuesday mornings, finding the questions that got me talking about the cattle or the irrigation or the problem with the east fence and giving me something real to say in return for the food she brought. Doyle Yarborough would be standing beside her, and he would be doing what I had seen him do at every county event, which was to be exactly as present as was required and no more. He was not a man of great depth, but he was a man of real decency, And decency at 28 with money behind it and the right kind of name is a formidable thing. I opened the refrigerator and took out the last piece of the apple pie Opaline had brought the previous Tuesday. I ate it standing at the counter. I tasted none of it. Leland Kincaid called around 8 o'clock. At the end of the call, with the ease of a man who does not realize he is turning a knife, he said, "The festival looks good this year. Lots of people turned out. Your neighbor looks like she is having a nice time." I thanked him for calling and said good night. At 9:15, I heard gravel moving in the driveway. I heard a truck door and then quiet, and then footsteps on the porch steps. I was at the door before whoever it was could knock. Opaline was standing on my porch in a dark blue dress I had never seen before, a long coat over it against the October chill, her hair down instead of pulled back. It was the first time in 3 years of knowing her that I had seen her in anything other than work clothes. For a moment I could not locate a single useful word in my entire vocabulary. She said, "I left early." I said, "Where is Doyle?" She said, "He drove me back to my place." I walked over from there. It was 40 degrees and fully dark, and she had walked a quarter-mile across a field in dress shoes. I stepped back from the door and she came inside. She stood in the middle of the living room with both hands still holding her purse, like a woman who had walked across a field and climbed onto a porch and was now not entirely certain that any of those had been wise decisions. She said, "He asked me if we could start seeing each other, officially." My chest tightened, but I kept my voice where I needed it to be. I said, "What did you tell him?" She said, "I told him no." I said, "Why?" She looked at me for a long moment. The look was not angry. It was something more difficult than anger. It was the look of someone who has been patient for a very long time and is beginning to understand that patience alone is not going to be enough. She said, "Because I am not in love with him." I looked away. I looked at the photograph on the bookshelf, the one from our wedding, Cressida and me, in front of the old barn with the oak trees behind us. It had been there for 23 years, and I had stopped seeing it the way you stop seeing things that have always been where they are. Opaline followed my eyes. I said I loved my wife. She said I know. I said I do not know if I will ever feel that way again. She said I am not asking you to. I said, if I let myself feel something like that again, what does it say about what Cressida and I had? What does it say about those years? She said, it says you loved her and that you are still alive. I closed my eyes. I said, I am afraid I am betraying her. Opaline took one step closer. She did not touch me. She said, do you really believe that is what she would want? For you to stay alone in this house until there is no house left? I remembered the hospital room, the late hour, the hand holding mine. Cressida had told me the only question was whether I was going to live or just keep breathing. I had been so certain I understood what that meant. Standing in the living room now, I was less certain. Opaline's voice was quieter when she spoke again. She said, I am not trying to take her place. I know I cannot do that. I just need to know if there is still room in your life for something new. That is all I am asking. I looked at her. Behind the steadiness in her face, there was real hurt, not the performative hurt of someone trying to win an argument. The real kind, the kind that comes from having shown up faithfully for a long time and finally said the true thing out loud and found that even the true thing might not be enough. I said, I do not know if I can do this. She nodded. She said she understood. She turned toward the door. At the threshold, she stopped. She did not look back. She said, but I cannot keep walking across that field every week and pretending I am only a neighbor who brings food. The door opened. The door closed. I stood in the living room in the sudden absence of her, and the quiet settled back around me. The wedding photograph on the shelf was still there. The kitchen was still dark. The chair at the table that had been Cressida's was still at its angle. Everything was exactly where it had been an hour ago. Nothing was the same. The following Tuesday morning, I was in the kitchen before 8 o'clock. I had filled 2 cups of coffee the way I always did on Tuesday mornings. I sat at the table with my cup and I watched the clock move past 9 and then past 9:30. The porch was empty. The field was empty. I looked at the second cup of coffee going cold on the other side of the table. In 3 years, she had not missed a Tuesday morning, not once. I had stopped thinking of it as a choice she made and started thinking of it as a feature of Tuesday mornings, like the light coming in through the east window. I understood, sitting there, that I had been wrong about that too. It had always been a choice. It had always cost her something, and I had accepted it without ever asking what it cost. And then when she finally asked something in return, I had told her Doyle Yarborough was a good man and looked away. I got up and poured both cups down the sink. The same morning, Petra Ingram called again. Her voice was different this time, softer at the edges. She said, "I heard Opaline come home last night. She did not tell me anything, but I am her mother and I know the sound of her walking when she is sad." She paused. "I want to tell you something I should have said last time. I called before to protect my daughter. I understand now that she does not need protecting from you. What she needs is for you to stop protecting yourself from her." She hung up before I could answer. I stood in the kitchen with the dead phone and looked around at the room. The empty sink. The two rinsed coffee cups drying on the rack. The chair at the table sitting in its proper place for the first time in 3 years, no longer angled away from the table, as though waiting for someone who was not coming back. I walked down the hallway and stopped at the east corner room. I turned the handle and pushed the door open and walked in for the first time since the morning I had driven Cressida to the hospital. The room smelled of dust and old paper and something faintly floral that must have been her hand lotion, faded to almost nothing now but still there in the upholstery of the chair. The ledger on the desk was open to the last page she had worked on. The mug was where it had been. The cardigan on the chair back was where it had been. I sat down in the chair on the visitor's side of the desk, the one where I used to sit when she wanted to show me something in the numbers. I sat there and I looked at the room and I let myself be in it without trying to manage the feeling of being in it. I thought about Cressida. Not the last months, the years, the early years when we were both figuring out how to run the ranch and how to be married at the same time. The years in the middle when the ranch was stable and the work was hard, and we had settled into each other the way that long marriages settle, comfortable and sometimes taken for granted, and real in a way that nothing else in my life had ever been real. She had hated it when I turned decisions into calculations. She said I could find 100 reasons not to do the thing I actually wanted to do, and that I dressed the reasons up as practicality when what they actually were was fear. I sat in her room for a long time. Then I got up and started to clean. I did not throw anything away. I sorted carefully, the way Cressida herself would have sorted, keeping what mattered and setting aside what could be let go. The cardigan I folded and placed with the things I would give to her sister. The ledgers I stacked on a shelf rather than leaving them spread across the desk. The mug I carried to the kitchen and washed and placed in the cabinet with the others. I opened the curtains. The light came in across the desk for the first time in 3 years, long and late afternoon gold, landing on a small framed photograph on the far wall. Cressida at 28, standing in the south orchard laughing at something just outside the frame. I left it where it was. I went out to the porch and fixed the loose railing post that had needed attention for 6 months. I went to the kitchen and dealt with the warped window frame above the sink. I moved Cressida's chair at the kitchen table back to its proper place rather than its memorial one. I was not erasing her. I was doing something different and harder than erasing. I was admitting that the house could still be lived in, that it could still be the place where something happened rather than the place where something had stopped. It took me until dark to finish. When I sat down on the porch in the cooling evening, across the field the lights in Opaline's farmhouse were on, small and distant but visible. She was there, running a farm alone, asking nothing from the man across the field except the chance to be seen clearly. I had made her wait long enough. The question was not whether I was ready. The question was whether I was willing to stop letting my fear make choices that belonged to her as much as they belonged to me. I knew which direction the answer lived in. That same evening, before I had fully settled on what I would do or how I would do it, I found myself walking across the field, not to her door, to the fence line between our two properties, the long stretch of wire and post that had marked the boundary of our separate lives for 30 years. Opaline was already there. She was working on a section of the east post, tightening a bolt that had been working loose for weeks. She had her back to me, but she heard me coming. She did not look up right away. She kept working, the wrench turning in her hand, and I stopped on my side of the fence and put my hands on the top rail and waited. She set the wrench down and turned around. I said, "I have been going over what you said. When you told me 20 years would not change a damn thing. I need to understand what you meant by it." She looked at me steadily. She said, "I meant what I said. I do not bring you food twice a week because I am looking for a younger version of you. I am not practicing for something better. I am here because of the specific man standing on the other side of this fence." I said, "You deserve someone who can give you more years." She said, "You keep deciding what I deserve without asking me what I want." I said, "Opaline, I am 50 years old." She said, "I know exactly how old you are." I also know that you drove over to fix my fence in the rain without being asked. I know that you stayed until it was done, even though it took all day. I know that after Cressida died, you kept every commitment you had made to every person who depended on you, and you did it without asking anyone for credit. She looked at me across the fence rail. I am not in love with an idea of you, Theron. I know your worst qualities, your stubbornness, the way you make decisions without consulting the people they affect, the silences you use as walls. I know all of it, and I am still standing here. I gripped the top rail harder. I said, I do not know if I can offer you what you need. She said, you have not asked me what I need. I did not have an answer for that. She picked up the wrench and turned back to the fence post. Before she bent down to work, she said, I am not asking you to decide anything tonight, but stop making decisions on my behalf just because you are afraid to make them for yourself. Then she went back to work, leaving me standing alone on my side of the fence with nothing to argue against and nothing to hide behind. I walked back across the field in the dark. The lights in my house were on, the rooms waiting the way. Rooms wait when you have been away from them long enough to see them clearly. I went inside. I stood in the kitchen. I looked at the east corner room door at the end of the hallway. I did not open it that night, but I stood in the kitchen for a long time before I went to bed, and the quality of the silence in the house was different than it had been the night before. 2 days passed. I worked the ranch with the mechanical precision that had carried me through the 3 years after Cressida died, the same precision I now recognized for what it was. On the first day, I repaired a section of the south gate that had been stiff for months. On the second day, I recalibrated the irrigation sensors on the east field. Both tasks took longer than they needed to, because I was doing them the way a man does things when he is trying to fill time rather than accomplish something. On the evening of the second day, I sat on the porch after dark with no coffee and no particular reason to be outside. The temperature had dropped and my breath was visible in the porch light. I was thinking about something Cressida had said to me early in our marriage when I had spent 6 weeks deliberating over whether to invest in the new equipment system that eventually doubled our herd capacity. She had watched me go through my calculations and my objections and my contingency plans, and finally she had sat across from me and said, Theron, you have already decided. You decided 3 weeks ago. Everything since then has been you looking for a way to be certain before you commit, and certainty is not something you find before the fact. It is something you build after. I had been doing the same thing for 3 years with the closed door, and for 3 weeks since the morning of the apple pie. Looking for certainty before I was willing to commit to anything. Looking for a guarantee that I had already missed my chance, or alternatively a guarantee that I had not, so that one of those certainties would make the decision for me, and I would not have to carry the weight of having made it myself. Cressida had been right in our first year of marriage, and she was right now in the form of a memory I had carried long enough that it had become my own understanding rather than something I was remembering. Certainty comes after, not before. I went inside and went to bed, and in the morning I got up and drove to the hardware store early and picked up the bracket I had been meaning to replace on the greenhouse equipment shed door, which gave me a reason to go to Opaline's farm without it looking like what it was, which was a man who had run out of reasons not to do the one thing he had been building toward for longer than he had admitted. On Thursday afternoon, I walked across the field to Opaline's farm. 2 days had passed since the empty Tuesday morning, 2 days of working through the silence and arriving at something that felt less like a decision and more like a recognition of what had already been true for longer than I had admitted. She was in the larger greenhouse on the north side of the property where she kept the fall crops. I could see her through the glass panels before I reached the door, moving along a row of plants with a tablet in her hand. She worked with the focused economy of motion of someone who has done a task enough times that the body knows it without being told. I opened the greenhouse door. The air inside was warm and smelled of wet soil and growing things. She heard the door and looked up. She did not smile. She did not frown. She watched me come toward her with an expression that was careful and still and waiting. I said, I was wrong. She folded her arms and waited for me to continue. I said, I used the age difference as an excuse because it was easier than admitting I was scared. I told myself I was protecting you. That is not what I was doing. She said, what were you doing? I said, I was protecting myself. From wanting something I was not sure I had the right to want, from starting something and losing it, from finding out that I was capable of feeling this way again. Because feeling this way again means I have to be a person who is still in the world rather than a person who is waiting for it to be over. The greenhouse was quiet around us. Outside the glass, the afternoon light moved across the dried fields. I said, "You told me I was deciding for you. You were right. I decided you should have someone younger, someone without the weight of what I am carrying, someone who would not need you to make allowances for what came before. I decided all of that without asking you a single question about what you actually wanted." She said, "And now," I said, "now I am asking." She looked at me for a long time. There was something working in her face that she was keeping controlled, the way you keep something controlled when you are not yet ready to let yourself believe it. Then the greenhouse door opened behind me. Wendell came in carrying a fitting for the irrigation line, head down, not looking up yet. He said, "Miss Ingram, I found the part you needed in the back of the supply shed. It was behind the fertilizer bags the whole time." He looked up. He saw us. He read the room with the particular speed of a young man who has walked into enough situations he was not meant to walk into to develop a quick instinct for them. He said, "I am going to come back." He went back out the door. It closed behind him. Opaline looked at the door and then back at me. The corner of her mouth moved. I said, "He asked me about you the first week he started working here. He wanted to know if the neighbor thing meant you were off limits." She said, "What did you tell him?" I said, "I told him you were 25 years old and my neighbor and the daughter of people I had known for a long time." She said, "That is not an answer." I said, "I know. I was aware of that at the time." She looked at me and then she did something she had not done in several weeks, which was to let herself be fully present in the moment, rather than standing slightly to the side of it. The carefulness went out of her face. What was underneath it was not soft, it was simply real. I said, "I cannot promise I will be healthy in 20 years. I cannot promise people in this town will not have opinions about you choosing me. I cannot offer you a life that does not already have a long history in it, some of which is not mine to move or set aside." She said, "I know all of that." I said, "I know you know." I needed to say it anyway, so that you understand I am not coming here under any illusions about what this is. I am coming here because I have spent 3 years being very disciplined about not feeling things, and what I have finally understood is that the discipline was not wisdom. It was cowardice with better posture. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said cowardice with better posture. I said Cressida would have called it that. She had a specific intolerance for self-deception dressed up as practicality. Opaline said she sounds like she was a remarkable woman. I said she was, and she would have seen through me a lot faster than I saw through myself. I took a breath. I said, "I want to take you to dinner. Somewhere that is not this county, so we can have a conversation without half the agricultural board listening in. I want to spend time with you as the woman you are, rather than the neighbor I have been careful not to look at too directly for 3 years. I want to do that honestly, with both of us knowing what we are doing, if you are still willing." She looked at me for a long moment. She said, "You took 3 years and several additional weeks to get to this sentence." I said, "I needed to think it through." She said, "I know." It was the same 2 words she had always said when I told her she did not need to bring food, the same cadence and the same quiet weight. But it meant something different now. Now it meant I see you clearly, and I have been seeing you clearly, and I was willing to wait for you to see yourself the same way. She invited me inside for coffee. We sat at her kitchen table and talked for 2 hours about nothing in particular and everything important. We agreed to go slowly. We agreed that the choosing was the part that mattered. Some of that first year was harder than I expected. There were evenings when I sat across from her at my kitchen table and watched her work through the logistics of a supply chain problem and felt the weight of every year between us as a real thing rather than an abstraction. Not regret. Something more honest than regret. An awareness that she was moving through life at a speed I had already lived at, and that some of the things she was just beginning I had already finished, and that this was the actual shape of the life we were building rather than a difficulty we would get past. I told her about it one evening in January. I said, "I am aware sometimes that you are at the beginning of things I have already been through." She put down her pen and looked at me. She said, "Are you telling me that bothers you or asking me if it bothers me?" I said, "Both." She said, "It bothers me that you are going to get old before I do. That is a real thing, and I will not pretend it is not." She paused. "But the alternative is not finding someone my own age who might never look at me the way you do. The alternative is spending my life wondering what would have happened if I had been less afraid of what the county thought." I said, I do not want you to spend your life managing my limitations. She said, Theron, you repair 60-year-old equipment when it fails instead of replacing it. You kept this ranch running through 3 dry summers and 2 bad markets without losing a single employee. You managed a grief so heavy most men would have buckled under it. She met my eyes. You are not a limitation. You are the most capable person I have ever had a serious conversation with. Stop asking me to see you as less than that. The first time I took her to dinner was on a Friday evening in early November. I drove an hour east to a restaurant in a town where nobody knew either of us, which Opaline tolerated without comment but with an expression that told me she was filing it away to have a view about later. The evening started awkwardly. I kept watching the room, adjusting to the unfamiliar experience of being somewhere with Opaline that was not a porch or a field or a farm store. I asked her at least twice during the meal whether she was certain about this. The second time I asked, she set down her fork and looked at me. She said, if you ask me that one more time, I am driving myself home. I said, that is fair. She said, Theron, I am 25 years old. I have been running a 60-acre farm alone for 2 years. I have negotiated contracts with distributors who were trying to underpay me. I have repaired equipment in the dark and the rain. I am capable of deciding who I want to spend my time with. I said, I know that. She said, then act like it. I laughed. It came out of me before I could moderate it, a real laugh, the kind that surprises you because you had forgotten what it felt like to be genuinely caught off guard by something good. She looked at my face when I laughed, and something in her expression shifted, the last of the caution going out of it. After dinner, we walked along the street near the restaurant. When we reached the truck, she reached for my hand. I looked down at her hand in mine and understood that this was different from anything that had come before it, in a way I did not need to explain. I leaned down and kissed her. When we pulled apart, she leaned her forehead against mine, and we stood there for a moment in the cold without speaking. Then she said, if only you were 20 years younger. I went very still. She started laughing. She said, I am joking. I stood there for another moment, and then I started laughing too, and the laughter was the final thing. The thing that closed the distance the kiss had begun to close. Because you cannot laugh like that with someone unless the fear is genuinely gone. Word traveled through the county the way word always travels in a place this size, faster than you would prefer, and with details you did not release yourself. A few people said plainly that they thought Opaline was making a mistake. What surprised me was how little she needed me to defend her. One afternoon she came back from the feed store, where someone had asked her directly whether she had thought this through. She said the man had asked with genuine concern rather than malice, and she had told him she was reasonably confident in her own assessments. She said it the way you describe a brief complication, not a wound. Doyle Yarborough came to see her once, about 3 weeks after the festival. He asked if she was certain. She told him he had done nothing wrong and that she had never felt about him the way she felt about me. He thanked her for being honest with him and drove away. The way he handled it made me respect him more than I had before. Leland Kincaid came to the ranch on a Tuesday in December. He sat on the porch and I brought him coffee without being asked. He sat with his cup and looked out across the field toward the south. Then he said, I owe you something, Theron. I said he did not need to do that. He said, I told you that girl deserved someone her own age. I said it like I was stating a fact. What I was actually doing was telling you what would make me comfortable, which is not the same thing. And I am old enough to know the difference, and I should have known it when I said it. I said, Leland. He said, let me finish. I looked at you and I saw your father's son, and I thought I knew what was right for you. Your father was my friend for 40 years, and I thought that entitled me to an opinion I had not earned. I am sorry for that. I said, you were not wrong that people would talk. He said, people talk about everything. That is what people do. It has never been a sufficient reason to stop a man from doing what is right. We sat on the porch and did not need to say much more than that. When he left, he shook my hand at the truck and he said, your father would be proud of you. Not for any of the things I thought he would be proud of you for. For this. He drove away, and I stood in the driveway in the cold, clear afternoon and let the words settle. Opaline and I kept our separate farms through the winter and into the following spring. We ate dinner together most evenings, alternating between the two houses. She presented a joint operational plan at my kitchen table one evening, a printed document with a clear legal structure, splitting ownership in a way that made us partners rather than dependent on each other. She did not want to depend on me. She wanted to be equal. That fact made me more certain about her than anything else could have. Wendell became the unofficial liaison between the two operations. He did not comment on the situation between Opaline and me beyond a single remark in February, when he observed that the Tuesday morning coffee situation seemed to have expanded into most mornings of the week. I told him that was correct. He said good and went back to what he was doing. In March, a storm came through and took part of the roof off Opaline's north greenhouse. I was at her farm by 5 in the morning with 3 workers from a contractor I trusted. We worked through the day, cold and wet, saving what could be saved and rebuilding what had to be rebuilt. By late afternoon, the frame was back up and the damage was contained. That evening, Opaline stood in the repaired greenhouse, looking at what was left of the morning's crisis. Her coat was muddy at the hem, and there was a grease mark on her jaw from where she had pushed her hair back with a hand that had been working. She looked tired in the way that comes from a day of physical problem, solving, the good tired, the kind that means something got handled. She looked at me and she said, "You showed up again." I said, "You knew I would." She said, "I know, that is what I mean." Then she said, "That is why I love you." She said it plainly, the way she said most true things, without making it into a performance or a question. It landed the way things land when they are simply true. I said, "I love you too." She looked at me for a moment with something in her face that was relief and certainty at the same time, as though she had known the answer but had still needed to hear it said out loud in the actual air between us. She said, "I know, you showed me before you knew how to say it." That evening, I brought her back to my house. On the kitchen table there was an apple pie. I had made it using the recipe she had written out for me on an index card the previous month. The pie was lopsided. The lattice was uneven on the left side where I had not spaced it correctly. The crust was slightly too dark on one edge. She stood in the kitchen doorway looking at it. She said, "You made that." I said, "I tried to." She said, "I can see that you tried." I took the ring out of my pocket. It was a simple band with a single modest stone, nothing that would look out of place on the hand of a woman who fixed irrigation lines and drove tractors in the rain. I had looked for 2 weeks before I found one that felt like something she would actually wear. I said, "3 years ago you brought me a pie," and I said something cowardly while meaning something true. I let the fear do the talking, and the fear told you Doyle Yarborough was a good man and told me that was enough. It was not enough. It was not even close to what I actually meant to say. She watched me with her coat still on and her hair still tangled from the wind. I said, "I know what I can offer you, and I know what I cannot offer you, and I have stopped pretending that what I cannot offer should determine whether we do this. What I can offer is this. I will be honest with you even when the honesty is uncomfortable. I will show up. I have apparently been showing up for years without fully understanding that is what I was doing, so I am confident I can continue. And if we build something together, I will not hold any part of myself back from it because I feel guilty about what came before." I got down on one knee on the kitchen floor, which was slightly uneven from years of settling in the old farmhouse, and I held the ring up and I said, "Opaline Ingram, will you build a life with me?" Not the life I already had. Not a life that erases anything that came before it. A life that belongs to both of us, that we choose together, starting now. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she put her hand over her mouth and laughed and cried at the same time in the way that only happens when a thing is both funny and completely real simultaneously. She said, "You are proposing with a burned pie." I said, "I can make another one." She said, "Do not you dare. I want this one." She took her hand away from her mouth. She said, "Yes." We were married in early October, on the strip of land exactly between the two properties, the boundary line that had been a fact of geography for 30 years and was now something else. A seam rather than a border, the place where two things joined rather than the place where they ended. The ceremony was small, family, close friends. Our ranch hands and farm workers who had watched the whole thing unfold from closer range than most. Leland Kincaid arrived early in his green truck with flowers from his wife's garden. He shook my hand and did not make a speech about it, which was exactly right. Petra Ingram came from Richmond with her husband and stood beside Opaline's sister in the front row and cried through the entire ceremony without apparent embarrassment, which I had not expected but found I was grateful for. Wendell stood at the back in clothes that were cleaner than his usual, but still not quite formal, with an expression of uncomplicated satisfaction that I understood was his particular form of blessing. The day before the wedding, I went to Cressida's grave. I brought flowers from the south orchard. I sat beside the stone for a long time. I told her about Opaline. I told her about the greenhouse and the burned pie and the ring and what it had taken me 3 years and several additional weeks to finally say out loud. I told her I still loved her and that the years we had together remained the foundation of everything I understood about what a life shared with someone actually meant. And I told her I was finally ready to understand what she had meant when she told me the only question was whether I was going to live. Standing in front of Opaline on our wedding day, looking at her face in the October light with the two farms spread out behind us and the people who had watched us stumble toward this moment standing around us in the tall grass, I understood something I had been working toward for a long time. Those were not things in conflict. They were things in sequence. They were together, the shape of a life being actually lived. After the wedding, Opaline moved into the main house, and we turned the east corner room into our shared office. Her desk went in on the window side, where the afternoon light was best. Cressida's old desk stayed on the far wall with her photograph still hanging where I had left it when I cleaned the room. Opaline had asked me, a month before the wedding, whether I wanted to rearrange the room. I said I wanted to leave the photograph where it was. She said, good. That was all she said about it, and it was exactly enough. Every morning I brought 2 cups of coffee into the room and set one on each desk, and I was aware every time I did it of the particular life I had built inside that room. The joint operation took shape through that first winter as a real enterprise. She handled the brand, the online presence, the finances. I handled the cattle, the equipment, the storage logistics. We made decisions together on the things that crossed between our domains, which was most things, and we disagreed sometimes in the productive way that comes from two people who both know what they are talking about and are not afraid to say so. The disagreements we had were real and sometimes sharp. In April, she wanted to shift the herd rotation schedule to accommodate a new grazing pattern she had read about in an agricultural journal. I had been rotating the same way for 15 years, and I told her that. She said, I know you have. Is that a reason to keep doing it, or a reason to examine whether it still makes sense? I said, it makes sense. It is what works. She said, it works the way you have measured it. I am proposing we measure it a different way. We went back and forth on it for 3 evenings. On the 4th evening, she put a printed summary of the research on the kitchen table and sat down and said, I am not asking you to change everything. I am asking you to try a modified rotation on the South 40 for 1 season and see what the numbers say. That is all. I looked at the summary. I looked at her. I said 1 season. She said 1 season. If the numbers do not support it, we go back to your way. The numbers supported it. Forage utilization improved and the South herd's health metrics were better by autumn. I told her she had been right. She said, I know. I am going to try very hard not to say I told you so. I said, you just did. She said, yes, but I tried first. That was the shape of it, that first year and the years after. Two people who had both been running land alone long enough to have strong opinions about how things should be done, learning to argue productively rather than defensively, learning that the other person's certainty was sometimes evidence rather than opposition. It was not always easy. It was always worth it. There were evenings in that first winter when I would come in from the barns after dark and find her at the desk in the east corner room, working on the financial forecasts for the combined operation, the lamp on and the room warm and the window dark behind her. She worked the way Cressida had worked, with complete focus, unhurried but efficient, the kind of concentration that does not require silence but does require not being interrupted unnecessarily. I learned the difference between the questions she wanted answered immediately and the ones she wanted to sit with, and I learned it the way you learn most things in a long relationship, which is by getting it wrong several times before you get it right. One evening in February, I came in with a question about the spring planting schedule, and she was deep in the forecasts. And I asked the question anyway, the wrong kind of question at the wrong time, and she looked up at me with the particular expression she reserved for moments when I was failing to use the common sense I had demonstrated in other areas of my life. She said, can it wait until after dinner? I said yes. She said, then it waits. She went back to the numbers. I went to the kitchen and started dinner, and the house was quiet in the way it had once been quiet, but was no longer the same kind of quiet. It was the quiet of two people in the same house doing different things and knowing the other one was there, which is the best kind of quiet there is. It took me most of that winter to understand that this was what I had been mourning for 3 years without having a word for it. Not the absence of a person, though that was real. The absence of a particular quality of inhabited silence. The sense that the rooms of a house have someone in them even when you are not in the same room yourself. The East Corner room had that quality again. The whole house had it again. And when I carried 2 cups of coffee into the office in the mornings and set one on Cressida's old desk where Opaline now worked, I was not erasing anything, I was continuing something. The rooms were doing what rooms do when the people in them are living rather than waiting. They were becoming the place where a life was happening. Wendell was promoted, which he had not technically asked for, but had clearly been working toward by simply doing more than was required of him every day for a year. The first time he referred to the combined farms as the gantry operation in front of a supplier, I heard it from the next room and had to stand still for a moment before I could continue what I had been doing. The first time he referred to the combined farms as the gantry operation in front of a supplier, I heard it from the next room and had to stand still for a moment before I could continue what I had been doing. He had said it without thinking, the way he said most things, and that was exactly what made it land the way it did. Petra Ingram came to visit in the spring, alone, her husband remaining in Richmond for a work commitment. She stayed for 3 days. On the second evening, after dinner, she and I sat on the porch while Opaline was inside, finishing a call with a distributor. Petra looked out across the field for a while before she spoke. She said, "When I first called you and told you to figure out your intentions, I was afraid you were going to hurt her." I said, "I almost did." She said, "But you did not." She paused. "I want you to know that I understand now what she sees. What changed my mind is watching you listen to her. Not politely, not waiting for your turn. You actually listen the way people listen when they are genuinely interested in what the other person is going to say next. She is not easy to listen to when she gets going on something. She is fast and she covers a lot of ground, and she assumes you can keep up." I said, "She is right to assume that." Petra said, "Yes, and you keep up. That is, in my experience, quite a rare thing." She said one more thing before she went inside to find Opaline. She said, "I want to apologize for how I spoke to you the first time I called. I told you to figure out your intentions as though you were a variable I needed to manage. You were not. You were a man trying to do right by everyone at the same time, and that is harder than I gave you credit for." I said, "You were trying to protect your daughter. That is the right thing for a mother to do." She said, "Yes. But protecting her did not require me to assume the worst about you. I made an assumption and I was wrong, and I think you deserve to know that I know I was wrong." She went inside. I sat on the porch until full dark and listened to the familiar sounds of the farm. At evening, the animals settling, the breeze through the tree line to the north, the faint sound of voices from inside the house, where 2 women who sounded alike, in ways neither of them had ever commented on, were talking in the kitchen. We sat on the porch until it was full dark, and Opaline came out and joined us, and the 3 of us talked for another hour about nothing in particular, and it was ordinary in the way that the best things are ordinary, without ceremony or announcement, simply the texture of a life being lived by people who have chosen each other. 2 years after the wedding, Opaline told me she was pregnant. We were in the kitchen on a Sunday morning, and she told me directly, the way she told me everything, without preamble. I sat down. I was 52 years old. I said, "Are you all right?" She said, "I am fine. I am better than fine." She looked at me carefully. She said, "How are you?" I was honest with her because that was what I had promised. I said I was afraid, that I was worried about all the practical arithmetic of it, the years, the unknowns, the things I might not be there for. The fear had a specific quality I had not expected. It was not the fear of death, exactly. It was the fear of incompleteness, of being the man who started something and left before it was finished. I lay awake some nights and ran the arithmetic of it. Samuel was born when I was 52. If I stayed healthy, I would see him through school and into early adulthood. If I did not stay healthy, Opaline would raise him on a farm she had built herself, with the operational knowledge and the stubbornness and the particular clear-eyed capacity for managing difficulty that had drawn me to her in the first place. I told myself that was a comfort. Some nights it actually was. I talked to Opaline about it on the porch one evening, the same porch where she had first appeared with a pot of soup 3 years before all of this, the same boards and the same railing I had finally gotten around to repairing. She listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her on topics she had opinions about. When I finished, she sat with it for a moment before she spoke. She sat down across from me. She said, "You have been showing up for things no one asked you to show up for since before I was paying attention. You showed up for Cressida. You showed up for me before you were willing to admit you were doing it. She was carrying a dish covered with a towel. The morning air was cold and clear, and the light was the low gold of November. I opened the gate and waited. She came through and set the dish on the fence post, and I took off the towel. It was an apple pie, the lattice pressed neatly at the edges, the crust an even brown all the way around. I said, "South Orchard apples?" She said, "First batch, best of the year." I looked at the pie, I looked at her. The field stretched behind her toward the two farmhouses, visible now as a single operational landscape rather than two separate things divided by a line. The greenhouse roof lines caught the morning light. The cattle were moving in the far pasture. I said, if only I were 20 years younger. I said it the way I had always meant to say it, without deflection, without the cover of a joke, without using it as a door I meant to close before it opened. I said it as the simple truth it was, which was that I wished I had more years ahead of me with this family than the ones I had. She looked at me for a moment. Then she took one step closer and put her hand on my arm. She said, 20 years would not change a damn thing. I do not need a younger version of you. She looked at me with the directness she had always looked at me with. She said, I need you. The exact man who walked into my life when he did, carrying everything he was carrying, and who finally decided to stay. I kissed her in the cold morning air. Then we picked up the pie and walked together across the field toward home. We did not speak for most of the walk. There was no need to. The field was the same field it had always been, the same soil my grandfather had broken in the early part of the last century, the same slope and the same drainage pattern and the same view of the ridge to the east that had not changed in 60 years of mornings. And walking across it with a woman who had crossed it in the other direction for 3 years before either of us was willing to name what that crossing meant, I understood something about continuity that I had not been able to see when I was standing still inside my own grief. A life does not have a fixed capacity. You do not love someone and use up the space and find there is nothing left. What you carry from one part of your life into the next is not weight, it is foundation. Cressida had built something in me, had built me into someone capable of being the man walking across that field. And Opaline had seen that man clearly, had waited for him to see himself, and had chosen him anyway, specifically, deliberately, without reservation. Those were not things in conflict, they were things in sequence. The frost was still on the grass in the shadow of the fence line, and the light was coming in low and gold over the eastern ridge, and the day was beginning the way days begin on a working farm, with everything still possible, and the work still ahead, and the ground solid under both our feet. I had thought for 3 years that I had already arrived at the end of something. I had been wrong about that in the most complete way a man can be wrong. This was not the end of anything. This was simply the place where I had finally agreed to begin.